We are living in times of great changes. The pace of the change that we see around us is astounding when we review the normal pace of human history. In our lives, just a single device, such as a mobile phone that we carry, has changed our way of relating to each other, our way of communicating with each other across the earth, as if breaking down the barriers of space and time through the internet. Instantaneously, wherever we are, we can see each other, converse with each other, send documents with a touch of a fingertip. And all of this has happened barely in the last 10 years. We've even forgotten what it was like in the days when you had to write a letter by hand, take it to the post office, and it would reach the other end of the earth after about 1 or 2 months, and sometimes it wouldn't reach at all. And you had to wait for 2 months before the response came from what you wrote. And the decision-making process, the cycle of decision-making itself, was so much slower. Today, the cycle of decision-making is speeding up and has reached a point where we have to take instantaneous decisions, the consequences of which can change the whole direction or may define the survival of your business, of your life's work. And yet you have to take that instantaneous decision based on information which is unreliable, partial, and which may even be promoted by vested interests. They say something like 90% of the news that we see or read is promoted news, which is defined by vested interests. In other words, lies or distortions of truths. And yet, in a growing information deluge, we have to sift through the 90% of confusion to get the nuggets of what is true. And our mind is in overload. We cannot humanly manage this pace of growth and change. It is almost as if evolution demands from us the awakening of faculties which have always existed within us, but which are being compelled to come forward, faculties such as intuition or inspiration, which can go right through the clutter and catch the nugget of truth. When you have to make a decision which involves an entire multi-million-dollar enterprise, and you have to do it now based on incomplete or even false information, how do you decide? You cannot use your reason. You have to tap into a higher faculty of knowledge, access that intuitive or higher grade of precise, infallible insight. And it is this character which is at the core of the current struggle of human evolution. It is this change which is defining the future survival or collapse of humanity. So before we explore the nature of this change, I want to take a view of the various prophecies, indications from different traditions, from scientific explorations, all of which point to some kind of a radical change. They do not always describe exactly the nature of the change. They catch a glimpse of it and articulating what they glimpse in terms that a mind cannot understand. How would you explain 100 years ago what it's like to live today with mobile phones, with television, with aircrafts, which have changed completely the nature of the definition of human life? And so 1,000 years ago, we find prophets, visionaries, saints, who had a glimpse of something to come, And across 1,000 years, how do you articulate what you see? Because what you see is also glimpsed in essential symbolic forms, the details of which are not yet formed. Destiny is not set in details, not in stone. It is a trend, a direction of unfoldment. And so we find in the Sufi tradition, interestingly, about 1,000 years ago, there is the prophecy of an Imam who glimpsed the future and said, 1,000 years from now, when man steps on the moon, Islam will rise to its highest peak, and then it will fade away. And we see this 1969 as the event of human beings stepping on the moon, and subsequently in the 70s, the rise of oil prices and the rest that follows, and the current crisis that the religion is passing through, compelling a kind of an introspection, a kind of a reformation of its expression. But a similar prophecy also is discovered in the Catholic Christian tradition, where about 1,000 years ago, there is a visionary. He was an archbishop from Ireland by the name of Saint Malachy in 1139 AD. He predicted what he saw, 112 popes to follow after his time, and the 112th would be the last. To each he gave a name, with each he had a short description of what would characterize their time, their rule. And the current Pope is the 112th. And according to Saint Malachy, it is during his rule that there will be the final day of judgment. We find similarly in the Buddhist tradition, Tibetan Buddhism, there is, as you know, the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, who is both a political leader and a spiritual leader for the Tibetan people, and the repository of the Tibetan Buddhism in experience and in knowledge. And there has been a prophecy for several centuries that the 14th Dalai Lama will be the last. There will be no other. And when I come from the Sri Aurobindo Ashram, which has a sister community called Auroville, some of you would have known of it. When the Dalai Lama came to Auroville, someone there asked him, "Is it true that you will be the last?" He was quiet for a while, and then he said, "It is possible." More recently, we know the confusion that has emerged in the choice of successors in the tradition of reincarnation, with the Chinese specifying their own successors and so on. And whether the present Dalai Lama chooses to reincarnate or not is itself in question. I point to these three major religious traditions in which you have glimpses or prophecies of some kind of a radical transition, and end as if to whole lineage. It does not mean the religion itself suddenly vanishes. That cannot be. What it does indicate is the organized form in which a religion can predominate will undergo a crisis, and a kind of a transition, the nature of which is inscrutable. We find in the Indian tradition, similarly, the concept of transitions between ages. We call them yugas. And there are passages of transition from one yuga to another. And the transition is always characterized by the end of an age meeting the beginning of a new age. And the principles on which the two ages are established are quite different from each other. And how do two very different principles connect? Well, there's always a gap. There is a disconnect. There is a transition. And so in the yogic tradition, we describe the transition of the yuga as a yuga sandhi, sandhi meaning the joining point, being always full of chaos. Because the old is breaking down, the new is not yet established, and you are as if between two different realities and you don't know how to deal with them. And sometimes, in major cyclical transitions even, they describe the transition in a form which appears almost destructive. Again, symbolically, it does not mean humanity is destroyed, but something, even civilization values collapse before new values can emerge and found higher and greater perhaps civilizations. And in the conventional system of calculation of the yugas, we find that around 3100 BC is the beginning of the great cycle of the Kali Yuga, which popularly is known as a period of darkness or chaos or confusion. But Sri Aurobindo explains that it does not necessarily mean that. The Kali represents matter and the establishment of things in matter, the realization in matter. And he said in an interview in 1907, he spoke of this. He said, in 1907, the first sub-cycle of the Kali, within the larger Kali, is ending. And there is the transition to a new sub-cycle. Now, this is a very important idea. In the larger cycle of an age, there are sub-cycles of changes, rhythms. And within each are sub-cycles and so on. It's the same in our lives. We go through certain transitional periods. All of us know of the transitions that we have to pass through in teenage, when we come into adulthood, when we come into responsibility, and then in adult age again, certain key psychological and even biological transitions. But within them there are always sub-cycles, important transitions, which prepare us for something greater. And so Sri Aurobindo observes that there is a first sub-cycle of the Kali within the Kali, and then from there the first sub-cycle of what is described as the golden age, the age of truth, Satya Yuga. And in between is the transitional passage, which is pretty much around now, 1907 onwards. Now these things, although I'm mentioning the numbers, these things are not frozen in numerology or by dates. They are rather psychological rhythms, and psychological rhythms always have overlaps. So the transition is on, let's say. There's no date when suddenly, miraculously something changes. But something is on, the likes of which we have never seen before. In the Mayan civilization, we find similarly a calendar. We have famously dramatized in cinema the year 2012, December 21st, at a precise time, I think 9:54 or something like that. There is the end, a dramatic end to a calendar which has gone on for several thousand years. A calendar which is so precise that even today it predicts an eclipse to a precision of 15 seconds. And suddenly this gigantic calendar comes to a stop, indicating what? Well, the end of an age, the beginning of a new one. And of course people expect some great destruction. This idea of a destruction has come because when from the past, 1,000 years ago, one glimpses a great transition, and in the great transition glimpses things which you do not fully recognize because the forms are not yet articulated, how else do you see it except the collapse of what you know and the beginning of things you do not know? And so destruction. Symbolically, fire representing a purifying influence, water representing a regenerating influence. And so these mystics, as they saw the fires and the waters, articulated in these words, which the common man does not recognize the symbolism of, and says, a great destruction by fire, by pestilence, by water. But the pestilence is psychological, perversions that humanity is playing with at present, of an extreme kind even sometimes. And so in this period we see transitions of an old world dying. The character of the old world at its peak was the age of reason, where humanity ruled by rationality, tried to organize life by rationality, and reason promised that all the problems of life would be solved. We would, with science, with reason, organize human society such that everybody would have everything. Everyone would be happy. Everyone would be content. There would be no lack. Well, this was the promise that reason made, which science made. With technology, the burden of struggle would be removed. What do we see instead? although great ideas came, there was communism, there was capitalism and socialism and many other isms, pragmatism standing above them all. With all these isms which promised to organize things, they failed. And we have to recognize why. Sri Aurobindo goes to the deeper psychological principles behind these isms and shows you how they represent great truths, but they fall short of a completeness. In the principle of communism, Sri Aurobindo observes, is the great truth of human equality. Communism tried to establish equality in humanity. We were all comrades, we were all brothers in a common life. But in order to develop that truth, in order to impose that truth, it had to suppress liberty. Because the fact is, although we are all brothers and sisters, we are very different. And when we are differently abled, differently capable, differently skilled, then we will always have hierarchies and different levels of capacity and therefore of possessions. So they had to impose equality by suppressing liberty. In the approach, in the truth of capitalism, we find the principle of liberty presented as the greatest. Everyone is free to do exactly what they want and discover their own potential and realize their own dreams. But in the process of this freedom, you find equality suppressed. Equality suppressed to a degree that even under capitalist framework in its extreme, everybody is a paid slave. You are paid to do something that you hate doing, but which you are required to do because you have to pay back the loans that you took from the banks, and you are running on the same spot pretty much to survive all the time. You have to keep running, hating what you do, so that one day you will have enough savings in order to do exactly what you want, and then you will be happy. So there's a very strange disconnect between the promise and the reality of the capitalist framework, and yet it represents a great truth of liberty. Sri Aurobindo observes that these two great truths of liberty and equality cannot coexist unless there is a third principle of fraternity. And this has to be the foundation. Unless this foundation is established, liberty and equality cannot coexist. So we take the example of a family. In a family which is bound with affection, perhaps even love, but at least with affection, we find that everybody gets their space, gets their opportunities. Even the elders will indulgently help the younger people to play around, realize their own dreams, even make mistakes at their cost, because they are family, because we have affection, because we have love. And so it's possible to have a framework of equality as well as liberty only under this foundation. But the foundation of fraternity, as in a family, is very limited. It can be my family against your family. As you see, for example, in many old lineages in Italy or in Afghanistan, where they continue to battle across centuries. Because my great-grandfather insulted your great-grandfather, we will continue to fight. And that kind of a conflict can still be possible across family identities. We need a deeper fraternity, a deeper encompassing unity which can hold all together. It can be a national identity. And we see how national identities, often with the national ego exaggerated, have dominated or even attempted to destroy other nations. Something greater? Humanity perhaps? But humanity is so diverse. How can I recognize somebody who looks completely different from me, thinks completely different from me, has values completely different from me? How can I recognize him as a brother or a sister or a friend? It's difficult, not always obvious how. And when we put these different cultures together and get them to try to work together, well, it's not easy. And yet it's possible if we go deeper to our more essential spiritual identities. And in our deeper reality, in our deeper identity, we are all conscious beings in evolution. We may use different vocabularies, we may use the word of soul, souls in evolution. We may use a religious term, children of the same divine, because there's only one divinity, there are no two. Whatever vocabulary we use, there is a recognition of an underlying consciousness deep within each one of us, which in its essence is common, and yet uniquely representing itself in each one of us, uniquely defining the line of our individual growth and development. In discussing the conflict between religions, and religions offered to also bring unity in the world, and they have not, they have only increased conflicts. But in discussing the future of religions, Swami Vivekananda observes that religion will continue to split, to divide, until a point will come when each one will have his own unique way, his own unique truth of expression, his own unique religion, way of relating to the divine. And it is at that point that religion will merge into what we call spirituality. In fact, this is the concept of spirituality in the Indian tradition, where we recognize there is one origin, one divine, one source, and each one of us uniquely expresses and represents that in the manifestation of the same one. Each therefore has a unique relationship with that and a unique way of rediscovering that. And to each line of self-discovery, we give a name, Swadharma, my innate truth, which is by definition unique and distinct from your innate truth. Your dharma is different from mine by definition, because that's your unique relationship. But all of us together share in a common sense of that relationship and the growth upwards in our collective and individual evolution. And so such a concept, such a deeper experience felt in the heart, shared among us, can actually heal the divisions of appearances. And it is only at a level of a consciousness which is free of form, innate truth, that we can find this healing of divisions across forms. And it is this which is the nature of spirituality. And therefore Sri Aurobindo observes, it is only on a spiritual foundation that human unity can be truly realized in a lasting manner, and these two principles of liberty and equality coexist under the underlying spiritual fraternity. And it is towards this that human evolution is moving. To the extent that it moves in this direction, we find humanity being able to work together as one family. To the extent that we fall back from this underlying truth, we fall into discord and conflict. And this is the core of the problem today. But I'm digressing from the point we made that each ism made a promise but failed because it caught a partial truth. And what is needed today is a deeper spiritual underlying truth that can reform, reorganize human life. And so the failure of rationality, the failure of reason, the failure of science, the failure of the modern age. Modernity characterized by the intellect has failed. And so we see the awakening of what we call postmodernism. Modernity has ended, rationality has failed. Now what happens after? Well, we don't have a name for it, we call it postmodern. And what is it characterized by? A subjective quest. We say, well, all right, rationality didn't solve the problem, and so now I fall back to my own innate need and pursue that. Follow your dream, follow your heart, follow your bliss, whatever the key phrase that we use. The idea is an inward turn, a subjective turn, and a need to fulfill your subjective truths. And therefore Sri Aurobindo, anticipating this transition, says, after the age of reason comes the subjective age. And he wrote this 100 years ago, mind you, before we saw all these changes today. Because that's the nature of the rhythm of the yugas. But there is, in the subjective transition, a false subjectivism, where I stop by with what I want to do. You ask your child, what would you like to eat? Ice cream, soda, or whatever the current fad of junk food is. But if you tell your child, that's not really good for you, I don't mind. You asked what I want this. But if you keep eating the junk food based on an impulse of a momentary desire, well, you will end up with a serious problem, as we all know. Is that really what the child wants? That's what his current desire wants. The same child as an adult says, no more sodas, no more junk foods, no more sugars. I want to eat organic, healthy. At this point, you're still pursuing my desire, but which is the desire, which is the superficial or which is the deeper truth of the desire? Well, as an adult, you have become now more self-aware, more mature, and the character of maturity is that you're aware of yourself in deeper and deeper layers. We are formed in so many layers. And the child at first is driven by this superficial impulse. As he grows in awareness, he deepens his consciousness. And if we stop short anywhere, we will inevitably end with the drive of desire, which will conflict with all other desires. All of us want to have the best of the world and rule the world, perhaps subliminally, just to be the king or the queen and have all the world and the universe revolve around us. At least we pretend as if the universe is designed to serve us. The child, 2-year-old, feels it truly. Whenever I open my mouth and shout, I get food stuck in my mouth. Whenever I'm uncomfortable and I scream, well, I get my discomfort removed. It doesn't work when you're an adult. You have to do it for someone else. So there is a whole process in which my ego center gets gradually thinned out and dissolved, and something deeper awakens. And it is that which characterizes maturity. And so the subjective age begins with a superficial subjectivism and a false subjectivism. If it stops short, it is destructive. But if you continue all the way in, there comes a point where you begin to introspect, when all has been said and done. Been there, done that, now what? And I seek a deeper satisfaction, a deeper truth of why I am here, what makes my life worthwhile. It happens every time we have a shock. When the 9/11 attack took place, there were many who were in this rat race, in the extremes of Wall Street financial play, who suddenly stopped and said enough and walked away. Well, they had made enough money, they could afford to walk away, but the point was they didn't want any more of it. It was a shock, that was a wake-up call. What am I going to do? I could have lost my life. What is it that makes my life meaningful? And turning often to follow their childhood passions or aspirations. And so often a shock forces us to introspect deeper, and the deeper we go, the closer we are to the essential truth of our existence. Answering the two great questions: who am I and why am I here? If you find answers to these two questions, your life is made for sure. You will be led by that. The resolution of the answer is not in words, it's in the experience. I'm conscious of who I am. The one who chose to take birth to enter this life in the sense of purpose, why I came into this world. When you awaken to that, you know your way. And whatever the difficulties, whatever the crises is, you'll find your way through it. But it is towards this that the introspection is really pushing us. And so as the true subjectivism awakens, it is the subjectivism of the soul, of the spirit. We have the transition from the subjective age into the spiritual age. This is the description Sri Aurobindo offers us in a text which he wrote 100 years ago. But much more detailed, describing all the nuances and complexities of these transitions. For those who are interested, it is surely worth reading. because it suddenly makes you understand why things are the way they are. And so we see a transition from the age of reason to an age which is defined by, characterized by the awakening of a common spirituality, and a spirituality which transcends religions, universal by definition. And in between the transitional passage is the subjective age which we are passing through. Now you see, the nature of the subjective age is extremes, false subjectivisms, true subjectivisms, partial true subjectivisms, all are in a pell-mell, chaos, potpourri, a big cauldron in which things are thrown in, forms emerge, collapse, reform, etc. This is the confusion that we see in the world around us. Sometimes truths are glimpsed, an attempt to give them form, but something fails because it is partial and it collapses again. And we say, oh, what a pity. But then it regenerates itself, now more complete, and again rises in a different form. And many deceptive truths at the same time. And so you find in the old prophecies these descriptions of deceptive leaders. I'm not using deliberately, I'm not using the religious vocabulary because they sound somewhat dramatic. But the idea that there are individuals who represent great truths and individuals who represent partial or even distortions of great truths, and humanity is confused. That's the present passage. In its worst, we see the kind of events that took place, for example, here in Orlando recently, which have shocked not only this great nation, but have shocked the world, and which make us question so many things. But these events are possible because some individuals went in pursuit of their moment's desire or passion, often perverted desires or passions, and went to such a degree that they lost themselves and became tools in the hands of forces and interests that pushed them to commit extreme crimes, destroying the very fabric of our humanity. And on the other extreme are people who are waking up to a deeper need and pursuing consciously a deeper process of self-cultivation. And I'm going to point to this as the key for the future. Unless we all begin to cultivate ourselves, become more conscious of ourselves, develop our own deeper and higher possibilities, the current trends are to slide down into chaos by chasing after momentary desires and passions. And there's a whole machinery out there eager to suck you into it. The mother comments on this. The mother of Sri Aurobindo Ashram comments on this in the 1950s and 60s. They're very interesting conversations. In one of them she observes that humanity is as if splitting, as if two branches separating. There's one part that chooses to lapse into some kind of unconsciousness, and another part that is struggling to rise into some kind of a superconscious awareness. And there's a split taking place, a gap that is forming. And it is in this split that you will see a higher humanity awakening and perhaps even a lower humanity living almost an animal-like life. Now, animal-like doesn't mean you don't have television, that you're not educated. You can be the most educated person watching TV every day and having conversations. But what are the values that drive you? Self-interest, moment's satisfaction of desire, not different from an animal. And on the other side, there are those who look at all this and say, yes, these are tools, but what do I use them for? And there's a turn upwards to a higher value. And this is the nature of the split. You may see the two people next to each other, in form no different, but in spirit very different. And sometimes you can make out just by the feel of the person, oh, this person is so much more awake. That person is lost in some kind of a dream, as if half asleep, somnambulism of some kind. And it is this which is the split that we see. In a sense, the current conflict that you see in the American elections, the two extremes of the forms, are symbolic of these two distinctions. Does not mean, because among politicians it's rare to find somebody with a higher spiritual opening, almost impossible one might say. But you still see this extreme split, not only in representations in politics, and it's everywhere in the world, but in the people, in humanity, people selecting and supporting, and you wonder, how could they do that? And they're wondering, how could you do that? And it's as if humanity is splitting into two extremes, which cannot understand each other. Now I'm describing all this because it helps us to better understand the nature of this transition. Because the new age, as it is emerging, essentially a spiritual age, comes into effect as we wake up. That process of awakening can be entirely subjectively pursued without any external support. There are people who have gone through deep processes of introspection and self-refinement and have attained to great spiritual heights. There are others who have used existing systems and structures, sometimes drawn from religions, sometimes drawn from psychological techniques and methods, yogic knowledge. Whatever the means one uses, when there is this pursuit of a conscious, introspective self-cultivation, there we see the awakening taking place. In India, this knowledge of self-cultivation was pursued, developed, refined, experimented upon and refined further and perfected over nearly 10,000 years. And this large body of knowledge we named yoga. The word meaning to unite. Unite our superficial, fragmented, individual awareness with our highest potential, with the oneness of the divine consciousness. That is yoga. That union is yoga. If you think about it, the nature of this passage is really the direction of our evolution. So in current vocabulary, we may rephrase the yoga as conscious accelerated evolution. Three things are required. It has to be conscious, because there is an unconscious yoga of nature. You do nothing, life kicks you, pushes you, you are opposing, you are resisting, and as you're kicked, you scream and shout, but you're compelled to move forward. That's the unconscious yoga of nature, and it takes a few million years before there is a major change in evolution. Well, among human beings it goes a little faster. But it becomes yoga when you make a conscious effort. And then Swami Vivekananda observes 1,000 years of evolution can be compressed in a single year. That's the kind of acceleration that is possible. Therefore, conscious, accelerated. And what are we doing in evolution? We are drawing out our own innate and higher possibilities. We are organizing in life things which belong to a domain not yet fully accessed. And the immediate next step in evolution is the awakening to a consciousness above the intellect, because the intellect has failed. That's what begins the evolutionary crisis. And now you have to access something higher, or you fall back to something lower. And that's the split in humanity. The access to something higher begins a series of higher and higher gradations. Sri Aurobindo takes great pain to describe the fine distinctions of these different levels, their characteristics of consciousness, and the means by which this ascent can be consciously made. But irrespective of that, let's just take a general sense of the higher being, the consciousness of intuition, which can give us that certainty, that insight, that knowledge in the midst of the confusion, in the current intellectual data overload. And so we come back to what we began with, a transition to a consciousness higher than the rational. It is this which is the current immediate evolutionary leap in humanity. A large part of humanity is already beginning, by the compulsion of circumstances, to tap into these higher faculties. As for example in business, when you find yourself overwhelmed with overload and you have to take a rapid decision, increasingly people are speaking about it. Many great leaders of industry speak of how they practice meditation regularly. In a recent study, the summary of which I saw on internet, Harvard School of Business Management declared that the future tools necessary to be effective in your business will be meditation and intuition. Well, these are interrelated. Meditation, the word is general, we can use it in many ways, but essentially involves a stepping back, a turning inwards, and a becoming quiet. And in that quietness, sometimes spontaneously the intuition flashes and there's a recognition of an insight or a truth. Or in that quietness, we feel a deep power or strength, which then gives us the capacity to deal with the challenges before us and to work through them. And so these are fundamental tools which every future CEO will have to develop. Well, that's the perspective of the Harvard School of Business Management. But there are others who approach it in different words, different vocabularies. The idea being an attempt to quiet the confusion of our consciousness, to rise above or turn deeper, to access these deeper and higher faculties. At the same time, there is a change in the rhythms of nature. We find in our geological studies that the Earth's magnetic pole undergoes sudden flips at different times in history. Measuring that shift in the magnetism in the geology, we see certain rhythms, certain cycles. And we find that the current poles are shifting rapidly and indicating a point of transition where there may be a sudden flip of the magnetic poles, which is due somewhere around now, meaning in the next 500 years. And the magnetic pole presently is moving rapidly, the most rapid in all the measurements of the last 100 years. It's moving at the rate of almost 50 miles per year, shifting towards Canada. And it's accelerating. The physical pole, which is distinct from the magnetic pole, the physical pole of the Earth is also moving. Was moving in a particular direction, but in the last 10 years, with the rapid melting of the ice caps, the top, the centrifugal spin of the Earth is being unbalanced. When ice melts, there's an imbalance, and what happens when a spinning top is unbalanced? It starts wobbling. So we measure that the Earth itself is wobbling, and the current direction of its tilt has changed. It's moving 90 degrees away from that at a pace that is speeding up, currently about 10 centimeters per year, and speeding up. Again, suggesting some imbalance, some sudden transition. We also see in the archaeological evidence great periods of what we call mass extinctions, where suddenly 80% of the life forms vanish and there's an efflorescence of new life forms. So there are two cycles. The smaller cycle is about 60 million years, the last of which, extinction of which took place during the time when the dinosaurs became extinct, and the next one is due sometime now. In geological terms, it could be in the next 1,000 years, it could be tomorrow, it doesn't matter. And we don't know how fast it happens because the transition is too rapid in the geological strata to be able to recognize. It could happen within days, it could happen within years, within centuries. In fact, the evidence today is that we are passing through a major extinction cycle of life forms. And it's because it is human caused. There is a name now being given to it in geology to describe it. I forget the name now. It was Homo something age, where we have made we are the cause of the mass extinction. It's unfortunate, but that's the reality we have to face. Now, from an internal transition, I'm trying to show that there is also an external transition in the rhythms of nature. And the two are parallel. Because nature is not separate from us. We are not separate from nature. There's an intimate link between these two. We are formed by the circumstances, the materials of our environment. What's your body made of? The food you eat. What's the food made of? The soil in which you grew it, and the pesticides and the chemicals that you threw into the soil for your convenience to kill pests, which are part of nature. And in the process, that comes back to you, becomes your body, and becomes cancerous growth in your body eventually. We are not separate from our environment. We are formed out of our environment. It's a very profound truth articulated beautifully in the Vedic tradition, in the Isha Upanishad. They describe the whole universe. The character of the universe is the movement, the whirl, the energy whirling, moving. So it is described as Jagat, born from movement or born by movement. And that's the emergence of the universe. And Jagatyam Jagat, Ishavasyanidam Saram, Yat Kincha Jagatyam Jagat. The tiniest universe within the universe is intended for the habitation of the divine consciousness. That's the first verse. And the idea is each piece that you see is the whole universe represented in a limited form, in a limited face, a limited front. And this is very characteristic of the Vedic view because it sees things in a unitive consciousness. So when you take, for example, a plant or a flower, what is this flower? It's not a separate piece. It is a representation of the plant, which is a representation of the soil, which is a representation of your nation, which is a representation of the earth, which is a representation of the universe. So it's the whole universe putting forward a front of flowerness. Each one of us is the whole universe putting forward a station of self-aware, conscious individuality, through which it looks at itself. We are the universe waking up, looking at itself and wondering, what am I like? You see, we as individuals have this illusion of being separate from the universe. So we say, I am observing universe and controlling it. But if you look through a consciousness which sees unity, we are the universe waking up and observing itself and then beginning to speed up its own evolution. Each time we intervene through what we call our discoveries of science, our technological inventions, it's the universe waking up to seize upon itself and speed up its own growth. And each unit, each piece is the whole universe projecting a special front. And so this is the insight that the Isha Upanishad, the text of the Veda, gives to us. And in this perspective, we begin to see things very differently. We find ourselves now in a transition where nature and individual are aligned. As within us there is this crisis and the change through an introspective process, so in nature there is a crisis and a change, and the two being linked, they align. If I may take an analogy, when there is a great change, there is as if a great wave. And in the ocean, a wave builds up from many miles. It's a tiny ripple that builds up gradually until as it approaches the shore, it becomes this gigantic wave. And we are like the foam on the crest of the wave. Or if you want to individualize the foam, we say we are wave surfers. We seem to be separate, but actually we are an expression of the foam. And as the wave builds up and moves forward, we can ride the wave on the crest and move with it. Perhaps a part of humanity chooses not to rise and goes out of sync with the waves and falls back. And that's the nature of the evolutionary change, a rapid leap, a breakthrough, so rapid in evolutionary terms that sometimes even the evidence of the transition is not obvious. Sri Aurobindo equates this with the last great transition when the human being emerged from the ape, with the missing link. The link is missing, it was there, but in geological terms, in terms of the aeonic cycles, it was so rapid that there's not enough time for the missing link to be established and found in your archaeological evidence. But it happened relatively rapidly, perhaps a few centuries, but that's very rapid in geological terms. And the human transition now is not unlike the emergence of the human out of the ape, and now from the human, a supra-human consciousness defining even a new species of humanity. Sri Aurobindo uses this word, a new species of humanity. And in the transition, even many intermediate species or variations of humanity. Not necessarily biologically different at first, but psychologically so different that you have to characterize it because it's a new consciousness, a new way of thinking, a new way of being and living. There's a very important problem we face today in biology and evolutionary biology. One of the signs that a species is heading for extinction is that it begins to lose diversity. In other words, it is no more plastic and cannot adapt to changes, and it is narrowing and becomes extinct when the changes become too great. That's a sign, a classic sign of a species heading for extinction. And the strange part is with human beings, when you look at our genetics, the diversity has been narrowing. And one of the suggestions that comes from evolutionary biology is perhaps humanity is heading for extinction. Sri Aurobindo answers this question 100 years ago. Surprising, he was very far ahead of his time by many centuries. He writes there that it may seem, because of the biological narrowing, that humanity is heading for extinction, but it's not true. He says, nature has built a vehicle, that's the human body, which is now plastic enough that she does not need to compel a biological evolution, and she moves now almost entirely to a psychological evolution. And we see today increasing diversity of human psychological types. That's the evidence that we're not heading for an extinction. An increasing diversity of psychological types and a rich variation and gradations, which point to this kind of a rapid evolution. So I keep this before us as a reference point that we are at a time of an evolutionary crisis in which a new consciousness has to emerge out of the old, a consciousness greater than the mind. Each one of us can participate consciously in this process, or will anyway be compelled by circumstances to grow. But when we do it consciously, we can be ahead of the pressure. We can be ahead of the pain of compulsion. You see, when you don't grow and life pushes you, the resistance meeting the push is the cause of the pain. But as we wake up consciously, the pain goes away and we are joyous in our leading at the cutting edge of evolution. That's where we are today. And we are heading for an age which is indescribable in many ways, because built on a consciousness which is so much higher, so much greater, so much more unitive, seeing things differently, valuing differently. And I conclude with a very interesting prophecy that comes not from religious traditions, but from the US military. You'll be surprised, US military is into prophesying? Oh yes, they are. The CIA in 1970s developed a technology called remote viewing. It was initially developed to access this capacity that all human beings have to glimpse across distance, to see at a distance. And the innate capacity is there, but some people can develop it and have a higher skill. So the CIA trained people, they developed a training program. It was used to spy. And recently they declassified 10,000 documents and which reveal how accurate this was. It was more accurate than intelligence on the ground. They had people projecting their consciousness across the distance, entering Soviet facilities and spying, drawing in great detail. But they discovered that they could actually project themselves in the future and see things ahead and in the past. So in one classic case, they had somebody observing a facility which was completely concealed. They had no way to access it. The person gets in and describes what looks like a submarine. He's asked to measure it. He gives you the measurements. It's too big to be a submarine and too far from the sea coast to be a submarine. And then they ask him to see 1 month ahead, 2 months ahead, 3 months ahead. And he describes changes. Eventually he says, now on this date, they break the soil, the land between this facility and the water. The water comes in and this big object floats out. So they had a date. They set their satellites to watch, and the world's largest submarine emerged from that facility on that date. Now this is what we find in declassified documents. What is interesting is the people who worked in this field of remote viewing, many of them are under oath because of intelligence and so on, but they could speak of other things. They said every time they looked at future, they found in the distance a major event, the likes of which they had never seen. When they tried to articulate the character of the event, they could only get glimpses. In one of the glimpses, they saw people on the earth suddenly shaking and falling to the ground as if the earth was going through an earthquake. In other visions, they had people looking up, seeing something in the sky, and on the battlefield, they drop their weapons and walk away because battle is futile now. So something radical, and they couldn't make out what. But what they could make out was what happens after. Projecting themselves in the period after, some years down after the transition, they said the whole earth has undergone a change. The extremes of the seasons have as if faded. We have a much more temperate climate everywhere, suggesting perhaps a change in the earth's axis. And then describing how humanity lives in perfect harmony with nature. Animals and human beings meet and play together as friends, and so on. Very idyllic descriptions. Timing, they're not able to specify. What we do see though, in the mother's description of this transition, she said two things. One was a change in weather patterns. She said Earth's climate would become more temperate. The extremes of heat and cold would fade. That means where there's extreme cold, there would be warming. Where there's extreme heat, there would be a cooling. And on the other side, the human body form itself would undergo a change. The human body becoming more androgynous. And she said it would be seen most in people who are practicing, developing their physical consciousness, like athletes and gymnasts. And we see this today. When you look at the Olympic gymnasts, their body form is such, you're not sure if it's a man or a woman. But such is the direction of the biological evolution itself, she said. And she said in 300 years, the human body will be more plastic than you can imagine today. Well, these are all indications of a very important transition. The point being, we are at a unique moment in history. Never before has there been a transition of this kind where we were conscious of the transition. From ape to human, it was a subconscious, nature-driven impulse. Never again in future it will happen, because once we make this transition, well, it will be a very different consciousness. And so, we are at a unique moment in history. Whatever the external struggles, whatever the chaos that you may see, we can make a conscious effort to look for the signs of an emerging, uniting, deeper spiritual truths, which also is organizing itself at the grassroots as the large structures of human organization are breaking down. So I pause here and I invite your questions, your comments. Feel free. Yes.
What do you think about the theory of evolution by Charles Darwin?
Okay.
Right now they're saying there's something wrong with his theory.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
Yes. So there's a very interesting, there are many studies trying to prove or disprove the conventional evolutionary theory of Charles Darwin, and the concept of survival of the fittest being the driving force, or random mutations being the driving force. In the fossil evidence, we find major lacuna. We find gaps. We don't find intermediate species easily. We do not find transitional species anywhere. We have as if a form and then another form and a gap in between. We do not know what drives those transitions. There is a very beautiful tree of evolution, but we're not able to see its steps or its processes. So it's fine to assume there is a survival of the fittest process, but we have not seen signs of it. And there are many other evidences. For example, the appearance of the eye involves 13 different steps of mutation, all of which are useless in themselves. But when the 13 are layered in sequence, we have a working eye. How do you explain that? It can't be by random chance. The yogic perspective is different. We recognize that there is an evolution of form, but the driver of the evolution is not random mutation or survival of the fittest, but the consciousness inhabiting the form which changes, which awakes, and organizes the material around it to better represent itself. If you see it in this way, we can explain how the I emerges, because there's a consciousness now driving the mutation towards a purpose. The contrary argument to Darwin is everything was created instantaneously as it is, which is not always satisfying with the evidence. But when you see that the driver of evolution is consciousness, self-aware or unconscious, but still consciousness, then we can explain and describe the whole process much more accurately. And the implication for us is we can consciously evolve and develop our highest potential. There's no limit to that. Okay, so yes, we have covered a very wide canvas, and we need time, in fact, to absorb and assimilate the whole perspective. The point he is asking about is the sense that there is as if a minority that is seeming to rise more rapidly, leaving behind a majority at humanity, which does not seem to be rising or awakening so rapidly. Yes, in fact, in evolution, the transition is always made by a cutting edge. The tip of evolution is very narrow. A few individuals who represent an extreme of the higher possibilities are the ones through which the transition is made. But there is always this, let's say, a pyramidal structure. As you go down the levels of consciousness, there are more and more which follow behind. So if you think of evolution as an impulse in nature, pushing forward, there's the tip, and a few of us, because we make a conscious effort, are closer to the tip. And then there's the mass, which is not so conscious, which is dragged along or pushed along by the compelling circumstances, or even crashing circumstances which force the change. The choice is ours, whether we choose to be part of the lagging humanity or the conscious cutting edge of humanity. And some of us are called to make efforts constantly to be on the forward edge. And it's a great joy to be there.
It's also frustrating, right? So
You're
how
right.
do you deal with that?
It is frustrating to be at the cutting edge because the forms of the new life are not yet developed. We have to develop them. We have to attempt things which work, and more often than not do not work. If you had conceived of the internet 50 years ago, how would you have described it? I'll surprise you with this one. The mother described it in the 1950s. And it was in a class she was having with students, and they were discussing money and the future of money. And she said, right now this is how it is, but in future there will not be any use of physical money. And then she's looking at the future and she's describing, and she says, they will find a way by which they will be able to link the point of transaction with some central point. And while you make the transaction here, the numbers will be deducted in the central point. And you won't need to carry money. Now this is a description of the internet and virtual, plastic currency payments, right? You're carrying a piece of plastic. The actual transaction takes place in a computer far away. You don't even care where. It's in the cloud, virtual. Of course, it's physically located, but it's somewhere far away from the point of transaction. And she's seeing this and describing it. And so, if someone said, all right, let's make this possible, where would you begin? There is no foundation of the internet itself as a backbone structure. And so you would begin with organizing structural frameworks upon which layers and layers of new possibilities would be attempted. And even in the domain of digital currency, so many new possibilities are emerging. Cryptocurrency, and then the new forms of bitcoins and so on. They all represent possibilities. Which of these will finally work, which will become established in the collective consciousness, we don't know. Perhaps all of them, perhaps something completely new combining all of them. And so we are in this period of great experimentation. and churning, where possibilities emerge, fall back, and new things come. Frustrating, but for a creative person, so joyous, because you're attempting new things all the time, and even if something fails, you created something which was never done before, isn't it?
In this coming age, or the age which we are passing through, the subjectivism, what do we do about education?
Yes. The great question is the current educational system, which is so obsolete, so much part of the old world. In fact, its origins are in the industrial age, where the whole society was thinking in terms of industry, and children were seen as raw material for the industry. And so a child had to be shaped, beaten into shape, to become a wheel in the machinery of society. That's the framework of the current education, modern education. So there has to be a postmodern or transmodern or deeper, higher, yogic framework of education, whatever vocabulary you choose to use, but something which bases on the deeper truths that every child is a soul in evolution. That's the foundation for the new education. And the framework of education is meant to help to develop the full frame of our personality and its capacities around the evolving soul. That together as a humanity, we may be able to work together in our evolutionary exploration. That would be the broad framework for future education. It would involve consciously developing not only the rational faculties and perfecting them, but developing also supra-rational faculties, including intuition, and even what today we call paranormal capacities. They're all part of our own higher possibilities, and they're meant to be developed and perfected. And the future education will work upon that. I have here on display some DVDs of lectures. There's one series which is on education, which is meant like a training program for teachers and parents. It's called Introduction to Integral Education. Those of you who are interested in this field might want to look at that. But all forms of life will have to be recast in this way. Yes, I'm glad you have connected the technological development with the consciousness development. So his point was that somehow the technology is moving so fast, consciousness is not able to keep up. And that's the interesting part. We are being forced to keep up with the technology, and so our consciousness is forced to adapt. And one of the things that we see happening, because of the way technology has connected us, breaking barriers of space and time, we are no more thinking purely in local terms. Somewhere in our consciousness, our mind is reaching out to connect to the whole earth. Because right now, a moment ago, I was texting or in communication with somebody who's on the other side of the earth. And so a part of my consciousness is actually linked across the globe. And I actually don't care where they are, what their national, gender or religious affiliations are. They're friends. And we're linked by this web of communication, I would say web of light, because communication in the fiber optics is light. So technology, actually, the pace and change and even the forms of technology are symbolizing, representing in material terms the truths of the spirit. The internet itself is a web of light, linking all humanity, representing in physical terms the underlying consciousness that unites all of us at a spiritual level. And the technology being in its essence the mind working in matter and organizing matter to realize higher principles, becomes effectively the link point and even a driver of the conscious evolution. Young children today at the age of 2 or 3, you find them playing with tablets as if they're so familiar and often doing things which adults find difficult to do. And it's even before their fine skills, motor skills of writing have developed. But their mind has been sharpened already far ahead of its conventional sequence, using the tablets. And so possibilities which would emerge normally at the age of 17 or 18 are now popping up at the age of 2 or 3. Prematurely perhaps, because the mind is not yet well organized, but already compelling some kind of a rapidity of change in the way they think even. Yes, the problem today is we are in a transition. So the question was, we make our decisions based on institutional structures, but will it work? Will it survive? Because things are changing so rapidly, even institutions are collapsing. We are living in an economic framework which belongs to the old world and the old consciousness, defined by greed, control, oppression, exploitation. That's the nature of the economic framework. Fine, some people can take advantage of it, perhaps all of us struggle to use it, but will it survive? In its current form, not. Will the transition be gradual or sudden? We don't even know. And yet, we have to take decisions today based on this current framework because the new framework is not yet in place. And that's part of the problem, part of the uncertainty of this transition. And if somewhere within us we have the right consciousness, or let's say we're aligned to the evolutionary impulse, we will sense. And we have to learn to trust that sensitivity. We will sense this looks like a good opportunity, but something doesn't feel right. And so you drop it. And something else may not look like the best, but it feels right, and so you follow that. And over time you discover within a year or so, it was the right choice that you made, the other thing broke down, etc. And we will have to rely on this deeper sensitivity more and more. He's asking about Maslow's model of the hierarchy of needs. There is a deep truth in that, but it is a bit reductionist. The idea is that first we are driven by physical needs. When they are fulfilled, we move to higher psychological needs. When they are fulfilled, we move to still higher needs, and so on. But in fact, you might find children, well before their physical needs are secure, they are already aspiring for, dreaming for something which is way beyond impossible. And these are the people who realize maybe a portion of their dream and revolutionize humanity. So the truth, the deeper truth is that our innate spiritual essence and our soul is the first driver of our revolution. External compulsions of security and satisfaction of desire are secondary drivers. Even environmental programming on us is secondary. It's a very interesting observation Sri Aurobindo makes. There are three influences which form us: our heredity, environment, and the impulse that the soul brings with it, its sense of purpose, its maturity. And where the three conflict, the soul can override the other two. And increasingly this will happen as we grow more conscious. And so the model is useful as a first step, but it does not help us to make the breakthrough that we need. Yes. It's a very interesting question. When we sense intuitionally that there is a spiritual evolution taking place, but we would expect to see great spiritual leaders, but we don't find them. In fact, we find a burst of great spiritual leaders in the last century, and then suddenly a vacuum. Often now filled by people who are nowhere near that greatness, but still very charismatic. And it's surprising. But this is the nature of evolution, that there are those who come who are on the cutting edge. They give a push, sometimes a great massive push to human evolution, and they pass. The results of their push may take a couple of centuries to develop and unfold and actualize in material terms. They are not there physically, but that influence continues. The impact of the Buddha's realization is felt even today because of its sheer immensity and power. But we do not see his form. And so it is with the great personages. But if their work is done on that level, there is still the unfoldment where we play out our roles. And so normally there is a push, but the push will not lead to more such personages coming, because they were not really the product of evolution, they were the precursors of evolution. We are the product. So what you see instead, not a few great people, but a shift in the collective consciousness, a larger mass awakening. Now it may start with very simple forms. For example, today, all around humanity, people are more aware of their body and health. If you go back barely 30 years and you told people, oh, you must go to the gym every day, you must exercise every day, you must do asanas or pranayam for your health, for your well-being, for your mind, they would say, what are you talking about? Right? Today you don't have to tell anybody. Younger people and older people are driven to make their body more healthy, more conscious. And it's happened on a massive scale. And the same is happening today very subtly. It's not yet come into the open, but I believe within the next 5 years you will see this increasingly in the public dialogue, cultivating the mind and the silence of the mind. Training the mind to be free of thought and of worry, to be able to consciously bring it to silence and focus on the work in front of you without distraction. This skill, this capacity, like the body and what comes with the asanas, that you're able to center your body, free it from restlessness. The same way you will train your mind to center and free from restlessness. And this capacity will be valued and people will work on it consciously. The practical form it may take is some form of meditation, concentration, visualization, which you see happening increasingly. So this kind of a mass awakening is taking place rather than a few special individuals. Exactly the point we made earlier. While one side is awakening, widening, freeing in consciousness, another side seems to be embedding further and deeper into sectarianism, narrowness, and maybe even blind ritualism, and sinking while another part is rising. The question is, what's the proportion between these two? That will define the nature of this transition. Both are there and they're extremes and they don't see eye to eye. They cannot see. They're so different. They're like two different species of consciousness. So when do you see Satya Yuga starting? I would say it has already begun. The fact that there is a sense of a global unity in humanity at a common level, and all of us are here because something in us resonates with that truth already. What is not obvious is the Satya Yuga now predominating and leading humanity. But the consciousness and the age has begun. The transition, in a sense, has been made in consciousness terms. It is now the organization of this consciousness in material life on a collective scale, which is a gradual process that we are seeing today. And sometimes nature will help us with a bit of a knock, a bump, a little bit of a crisis, a nudge to help speed up. But nature's intention is not to destroy humanity. All this effort was meant for a breakthrough, not for a destruction. And the structures created today are intended to serve the future, not meant to be destroyed. What is destroyed, to be destroyed, is the structures of the past, which have outlived their need and are suffocating human progress. There you will see breakdown. But these other structures emerging are peer level, collaborative structures, which represent the first steps of the future. We are already in it. Does that make sense? Yes. It would be so much simpler if we could bring this right at the heart of the change-making processes at the institutional levels, and if the institutions consented to change, it would be so much simpler, so much more rapid and painless transition. Just as an example, in the United Nations, Sri Aurobindo makes this observation. The First World War led to the League of the Nations, which was insufficient. It broke down as a structure. Second World War led to the United Nations, which was better, he said, but still this idea of a few countries having the veto power, that would be the barrier, he said. And there would have to be a third structure which would emerge, more equitable, where each one would be equal as a nation. Now either the UN itself can make that transition consciously, remove this veto power which belongs to the Cold War mentality and has no relevance for the future, or it becoming irrelevant would be replaced by a new structure emerging, which would be a longer, more difficult process. So we have a choice. Do we do it consciously, rapidly, easily, or pass through a painful transition? And we are still in between these two possibilities. That's, in fact, there was mentioned earlier in introduction, I was part of a group that has been visiting the United Nations climate summits every year. And in the last meeting, which was in Paris, we were the only group which was bringing in the deeper spiritual perspective of the climate change and the transition. Almost all the other discussions centered around money. For example, there was one session which I don't remember the exact title, but something like financial opportunities in new climate technologies. So it's like, here's the earth breaking down, how can you make money out of it? Okay, that's useful perhaps. And so I even commented in our session, interestingly, we were given one of the largest rooms. So somebody in the UN valued this session. It was titled, I think, Spiritual Dimensions of Climate Change. And I said in that meeting that perhaps this is the single most important session in the whole climate summit, because it's going to the heart of the problem and our relationship with nature, with Mother Earth. But yes, it would be so much easier. Mother makes this comment, she uses this phrase, if humanity consented to change. That's what it means. If we accept, it will happen quickly. It's a very important difficulty which we have to address. All of you are living in a space where the culture is very mixed. You have the best and the worst, and your children are exposed to both, and they may not always have the discrimination. How do you ensure that they get the best? And the first thing we have to do is to make them conscious. Of what? Of their own deeper inner sensitivity, where they feel they know this and not that. You can give them all the lectures you want. This is not good, that is good, and often there will be a rebellion, a revolt. But if you make them sensitive, they go into a space or an activity which is unhealthy in consciousness terms, and they feel uncomfortable, and they walk away. If they are under peer pressure, they may sit through it, but they will not engage in it psychologically or spiritually. But it does mean for them a slight difficulty, because they may not always be able to participate. But if there are enough of them, they may form their own group, their own structures, their own forms of expression, which may invite others to join also. That's the struggle that we have to deal with. So the first step is making the children conscious of their own deeper sensitivity. It takes two forms. At the earliest years, expose your children to higher spiritual vibrations. In your own home, you have a space where you may sit for prayer, for meditation, some form of puja or worship, where you create a space of sanctified vibrations. Let your children be with you in their early years. Let them participate in the activity, in the concentration, and let them get immersed in and absorbed in that vibration, that it becomes familiar and normal for them. In your own home, ensure that there are not activities or vibrations which are contrary. That means the kind of music that you play, the kind of things you speak or do, the values that you yourself express as parents. So it does not help to tell a child, if so and so phones, tell him I'm not at home. You've just taught your child to lie. Because you did it, he has learned how to do it to you now, and to himself eventually. And so you have to set the standards, and it's not easy. But we make the effort, and we fail sometimes. The child sees us making efforts, and that's the example. He sees us fail, and he sees us persist in making efforts. That's the example. And he learns that to follow his deeper innate truth, even when you fail, even when it's difficult, is the higher value. That's the example you have placed. So this is the first step you will begin with. The second step is then to speak of it in these terms. Make them conscious. As their mind becomes more organized and self-aware, tell them, look, the world is full of mixtures, and you have to choose, and you have to follow your deepest sensitivity. When you know something is not all right, something is not healthy for you, be careful. And even if you explore it, be wary and know where to stop, where to pull back, and speak in such terms, giving them that responsibility. making them refer inward. So if they do something wrong, rather than giving a long lecture and moralizing, which only creates a reaction, you ask them, what do you feel? What would you really want to do? I have a classic example which I love narrating, which was given to us from one of the schools where we have this approach of integral education. So the teacher here was watching two children fight, and she didn't rush in, she didn't make a scene, scold them, she watched. And then one of the children came down and sat next to her, very unhappy. So she asked him, what happened? I fought with my best friend. She asks, what do you feel? You see the inward turn. And then he begins to explore. And he says, it's paining in my heart. In Hindi, idhar darad hota hai. And she says, what do you want to do? I want to be friends with him again. And then she asks, what's stopping you? And the introspection is now complete. He moves forward, goes there, makes friends, they start playing, and they start fighting again. But the point was the inward turn of introspection. There was no moralizing, no scolding, there was only making conscious of what? Of your deeper reference, which is already there. And in children, if you have not allowed it to become covered up and they have not become hardened, it's there. You have to cultivate it and give it its central place. That's the two things we can do to help this as parents. The rest become incidental and corollaries of these two things. Right. So the concept of karma becomes obvious when you look at the big picture. When you limit yourself at a small level, it's like I did this and now I get punished. But that's not true, because the universe is not designed to punish and reward. It's all about awakening and growing and evolving. But when you look at the big picture, what you see is this. Suppose you're swimming in water. You push the water. You get pushed back. Okay? That's action and reaction. But on the other side, the push that you made ripples out. And because everything is connected, eventually the ripple comes to you and hits you. Right? That's also a more subtle form of the karma. So in the physical domain, the gross karma is I push and I get pushed. But in the psychological domain, when I throw out a thought or an emotion as an energy, it ripples out and eventually comes back to me because it's made of my own substance of thought and feelings. And when it comes back to me, it attaches itself to me, bringing those vibrations which I threw out. So if I'm used to throwing a lot of anger or hatred towards people, eventually I find myself locked in a mesh of anger impulses, which begin to seep into my biology and create even physical illnesses. I get a stomach upset, or I get bile in the stomach, or digestive problems, because often anger is based in the stomach region, in the subtle body, and so in the gross body it creates problems there. And so you see a circle completing, and that's the true sense of karma. It's not that somebody is sitting down there to reward you or punish you. It's just the natural consequence of the ripples of your own actions, physical, emotional and mental, equally spiritual. Now karma is not always negative. You have also the positive energies you put out which come back to you. And when positive and negative energies meet, they tend to neutralize each other or modify each other in some form. And the most important thing, you can rise above. Let's say you produced a ripple on this level of consciousness. As long as you live here, it hits you. If meanwhile you have evolved in consciousness, this level no more bothers you. When you rise in consciousness and purify yourself sufficiently that anger is now alien to you, the impulses that you threw out in the early phase of your anger, they don't touch you anymore because you have grown beyond them. And so karma is not a compulsion, it's not mathematical, it is not binding. As long as you live in that domain, it affects you, you rise, you're already free of it, partially or fully. There's a third factor. There can be an invocation of a higher consciousness. I may not be able to rise, but I can invoke a higher consciousness in my heart, in my mind, in my environment, which may neutralize the past karma or its effects. And this is the importance of the prayer, of the invocation, of the meditation and concentration on higher states. as we grow in closeness and consciousness to the divine, and that consciousness suffuses us and surrounds us, we are as if insulated from past effects. This is the point Sri Krishna leads us to in the Bhagavad Gita. When you act from immersion in the divine consciousness, you do not have the consequence of karma even. You are free. So this higher perspective is more important. You see, traditionally they emphasize karma more to make you behave well. Don't do bad because you will get punished. It's good, it's a good start, but it's not helpful for the awakening. So many philosophers have put stress on reason and rational life. That is the question she's raised. Yes, during a certain phase of human development, reason was the highest reference, the highest value. And during that phase you had all these great philosophies which came forward. But now, if you try to argue out, if you try to convince somebody with reason, it doesn't seem to work somehow, because that age is fading out rapidly. There are even people who will say, oh, that's too intellectual, it doesn't satisfy me. My satisfaction is coming not from rationality, but by something deeper, which can use rationality, but itself is supra-rational. So now we are making a transition into an age when, yes, rationality has its place, but it has no more its preeminent place. Something else is greater. And that greater thing can use rationality as a vehicle to convey its vision, its inspiration. But the source is not primarily rational. It's not logic which drives you, but an insight, a deeper conviction of truth, which you then articulate in rational terms. So here is the challenge for humanity. We have to train our mind, to train the skills of rational powers. But we have then to seek for truth above rationality and articulate using rationality. So rationality is a tool, no more the origin of knowledge. I think we can, yes.
The foundation of most of the all religions is basically some kind of revelation of pioneer.
Yes.
Then it became faith as a
Yes.
vehicle which continued in the masses. Now in the age of subjectivity and the following age, what happens to that process?
Yes. If you look at all religions, the origin is in a spiritual experience or inspiration. Often with one person who is now the founder of the religion. But the articulation of the religion, because it had to access people who were not even fully rational, let's say 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, the articulation took forms which were much more mechanical. My founder did this, therefore I should do this. Or the cultural and historical circumstances now become embedded and define the character and forms of the religion, which have nothing to do with the spiritual experience or inspiration. I have a story, it's a little longish, but it is so revealing. It's a story of a yogi who's sitting in the forest and he has a pet cat. Every time he meditates, the cat disturbs him when it's hungry, paws him, wakes him up. So he ties the cat and sits for his meditation and then releases the cat. One day he says, I have to go on a pilgrimage. He leaves the space for his disciples. He comes back in 6 months and he finds his little house in the forest is surrounded by a marketplace. There are shops selling cats. And every shop says, buy my cat, genuine descendant of the master's cat, tie him to a pillar and you will get good meditation. It illustrates the problem of religions, where you capture a particular form of behavior which had nothing to do with the spiritual experience and make that central. My founder wore this dress, therefore I must wear this dress, and so on. So in the transition, all religions are undergoing through a kind of a breakdown. These extraneous forms are becoming less relevant. Even we are forced to discard them. You'll see often this is happening because people are moving across cultures, and in different circumstances of different laws, different nationalities, they cannot follow those specific practices anymore. What do? The form of the practice is replaced by a new form in tune with the essential spirit. You are forced to introspect, find the essential truth behind that form and give it a new form, or it gets discarded altogether. For example, there were communities which didn't believe in using any machines because, well, you find them today having to use a car. If they want to survive, if they want to get groceries, they have to use a car. And this happens in this space in America. We found recently some Amish people who were driving around, which is not in consonance with their stricter forms. If you don't make those compromises, but you ask, why do they not do it? And you go to the why, to an essential principle, the principle is free of forms. It can be recast into any form under any circumstance and it will still be valid. At the level of principles, and especially spiritual principles, you are universal and eternal, because spirit is universal and eternal. At the level of form, you necessarily break down eventually because circumstances change. Forms will break down. So all religions are going through this discarding of the most extreme extraneous forms, narrowing to rediscover their essential principles and recast in new forms. And a point will come, as Swami Vivekananda suggests, where each one will have his own way of following the same spiritual principles. That is the nature of the dharma and the dharmic approach to life. So in summary, we are at the most important and the most interesting passage in human evolution. The mother goes so far as to say, being so important, it is worth it to not waste our time in things which, well, we have done many times before, which are being done by so many others. There are things we can do and should do which are given to us now uniquely as an opportunity. And to dedicate ourselves to those possibilities is worthwhile and makes our life meaningful. The form it will take in each one of our lives may be different. If you're working in the field of technology, it will be finding new ways to express these higher possibilities through technology. If you're at home looking after your children, it will be awakening these deeper values and higher possibilities in your children. If you're working in a specific form of business, review the relationships and the prime drivers of your business and your organizational structures and your means of inculcating values and disciplines. And bit by bit, in whatever space is given to us, we can begin to make changes outside us. But the external changes will be only as effective as we are able to make those changes first within us. And so the prime driver of our evolution is going to be the time we give to ourselves in conscious self-cultivation. Yoga by other means, other terms. You don't like the word yoga, don't worry. Conscious self-cultivation. And it means you must give time every day. 5 minutes or 10 minutes at least, where you sit quietly, shut out from you all of the world. Become conscious of that inmost, deepest and highest center of aspiration, where deep within you come your highest aspirations, where deep within you there is the sense of quiet, causeless joy, or a deep sense of purpose, meaningfulness, or a deep sense of completeness in communion with the one who is all, with the divine. I'm using words which point in the direction without using religious or technical terms. These are the experiences we have when we are in that quiet space, and to be in that, in communion with the divine presence in whatever way. To remain thus for 5 or 10 minutes every day. And then from that state to turn to look at the life before you, the circumstances given to you, the work ahead for the day, and see it all in context of this. And from there, gently move into the form and action of life. And then during the day, whenever you find yourself perplexed, confused, or in doubt, pause, turn inwards, briefly reconnect. Perhaps not as deeply, momentarily even, superficially even, but reconnect even with the idea or the memory of that presence. And then turn again to the difficulty, and you will find the help, the insight, or the strength to deal with it. So very simple, basic practice, but when sustained, repeated many times in the day, you will find very quickly things beginning to change within you and therefore around you. And this is how we will all participate and have the joy of being consciously the precursors, forerunners of the great evolutionary awakening that is taking place around us and within us. On this idea, we can briefly concentrate, sit for half a minute.